Hennepin County, they will no longer charge most felony cases that stem from sort of low-level traffic stops, and we'll break down what that means here in just a minute. But excuse me, things like a broken taillight, expired tabs, tinted windows. This is a new policy decision that was announced late last week by the county's top prosecutor, Mary Moriarty. It has set off kind of a firestorm of criticism as well from people, including the Hennepin County Sheriff, several Hennepin County police chiefs, also the Minnesota Police and Peace Officers Association. And then yesterday, I don't know if you saw, but we had a Republican Congressman Tom-Emmer here. He brought it up, specifically calling her out. So joining me now to answer some of those questions about the new policy and respond to some of this criticism is Hennepin County Attorney Mary Moriarty. Thanks for making the time to come in and chat with us about this. So first of all, I kind of want to set this up by asking, how long had you been working on this policy? Was there something that prompted it for you?
So I think it's important to know that actually the office had been talking about this policy for years, including when Mike Freeman was the Hennepin County attorney. We had been working on it, having the conversation about it. In fact, my first year in office, I was at a Hennepin County Chiefs Association meeting. They have them once a month. And one of the chiefs asked me if we were going to come up with a pretext policy similar to what they have in Ramsey County. And I said, that's something we need to talk about. And I talked to them about the data that the Minneapolis Police Department found a gun in less than half of 1% of the time they searched a black driver. They stopped and searched a black driver. And I said that meant 99.5% of black drivers who were stopped and searched had nothing, yet they were put through the trauma, the experience of being stopped and searched. And I said, that data tells us a lot. It tells us that that particular strategy is ineffective, especially in a time where law enforcement has limited resources. And so what I said to all of the chiefs at that time is, I think you need to start having conversations with your community, with your mayor, with your city council members. Look at your own data. If your data is better than that, share it with the rest of us, because I think we want to know what you're doing that's more successful. Yeah. So I started having that conversation with them in 2023.
Okay, and then I'm sure you've seen the next day there was criticism from many of them were Hennepin County police chiefs who said this was the first we heard of the actual policy being put into place was that day of the announcement. Did you have conversations along the way with anybody?
Well, yes, we did. Had conversation with many people in community, organizations, with the police chief specifically. My first year in office, when I met with them, I said, what do you want from the Hennepin County Attorney's Office? And they said, we want communication and we want to be a part of making policy. And I said, absolutely, let's do that. I assigned a very experienced prosecutor to be their liaison. They have his cell phone number. They have my cell phone number too. They can contact him anytime. And I met with them in groups of four times a month my first year. We worked on some policies. And then when we charged the trooper, they stopped meeting with me. They just wouldn't meet with me anymore. And some of our experience has been, and I think it's important to know that there are about 38 different law enforcement agencies in Hennepin County alone. Some of the chiefs, the heads of those organizations, are fantastic, and they work collaboratively. Some of them just will never accept any policies that we come up with, and the problem becomes the people that won't really engage us in good faith would leak that. The Hennepin County Police Chiefs Association has hired a Republican PR firm. They are actually responsible for putting out that press release to correct the data that they put out there. So as much as I really want to work with them, and I would love to, because I think that that's best practices, it has been really difficult given the number of them and the number of them that just aren't interested in discussing any kind of changes. But I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. We put off the implementation date of this to October 15th. And our plan here is to engage with community. We'll be doing that tonight, and also law enforcement.
Okay. Can we go back and let's talk about pretext stop, because I don't want to assume that everybody who's watching knows what that is. Can you give us an example or two? And is there a spectrum of sort of a standard pretext stop and then maybe pretext stops where an officer may have some overreach there that's more egregious?
So that's a great question, because the idea of a pretext stop is confusing. So this policy is about non-public safety traffic stops. So police can make traffic stops for speeding, right? For going through a stop sign or a stoplight. This policy is not about that. We have seen dangerous driving. We've all experienced dangerous driving when we're out there on the roads. We want to encourage law enforcement to focus their limited resources on policing those types of traffic stops. So this isn't about those at all. A pretext stop simply means that a police officer articulates a reason that they've pulled somebody over, but it really isn't the reason why. So for instance, I think one people hear about frequently is someone has a dangling object from their rearview mirror. And, you know, I have even heard, I've listened to body cam, squad video, and you can hear police sometimes saying, oh, what are we gonna, we should pull this guy over. What are we gonna pull him over for? Well, he doesn't have a seatbelt. He doesn't have, or he has a dangling object or something like that. So while the stop might be legal, it is not for the reason that they're articulating. So in other words, if an officer is behind somebody weaving, you know, and they have a legal reason to believe that that person might be drinking, you know, driving intoxicated, they're speeding, they went through a stop sign, they have every right to pull them over. These kinds of stops don't impact public safety, and they are simply a pretext to kind of check out the driver to see what they might be up to. Now, the problem there is, you know, a lot of unconscious bias comes in, and the data shows us that so many of those stops are made of Black and brown community members. So that becomes a huge problem. The data also tells us that with those stops, they yield very little success. So that's where we get to the numbers where the Minneapolis Police Department was stopping drivers on a pretext on low-level, non-public safety traffic stops, and they were only getting a gun in less than 0.5% of the time. So it's important to realize, if you look at any data, by the way, this isn't about Hennepin County, Minneapolis, it's not criticism of them. This data you'll see in any department in the country that measures this. Really large racial disparities in the stops, really low levels of effectiveness.
And it's interesting, and we don't want to do a deep data dive here. People want to go, there are different resources that they can go check that, but I thought it was interesting that you had data points, and then the law enforcement community that was critical brought their data points, and it seemed like you were kind of looking at the same data, but maybe it was interpreted in different ways, or no?
No.
You're saying no? Okay.
No, actually, one of the things I've said to law enforcement is, let's see your data. And I have yet to see data from individual police departments, but here's what's really interesting about the data that they shared in this press conference. We hadn't heard that before, right? What they said was they found 147 guns, I believe it was, in traffic stops, right? So, and we don't know whether those were non-public safety traffic stops, like the dangling object on the mirror, or speeding or something like that. But what was really fascinating, and I think really telling later on, when I think they were talking about the number of total stops, traffic stops. First they said it was over 93,000, and then they issued a correction. It was actually over 100,000.
Yeah, 101,000.
Right.
Yeah,
so
okay.
So actually their data agrees with agrees with all the data across the country. That is a failure rate of 99.27%. The data they gave us, that they gave the public, is actually worse or underperforms what MPD was doing with a less than 0.5%. So the data they put out there actually is confirmed, you know, the data that we're talking about here. So that supported our argument here, and so it's hard to know what they were thinking in terms of why do they think that data helps, because once again, it shows how ineffective these stops are.
I couldn't help but notice that during the press conference last week, you had Ramsey County Attorney John Choi standing next to you, and he was able to talk about their experiences in Ramsey County. So can you, just in case people missed it, tell us a little bit about that, and is that an apples to apples comparison, I guess?
Yes, absolutely. So the Ramsey County Attorney's Office and Ramsey County Attorney John Choi implemented pretty much the same policy that we are. I think our language is pretty similar in 2021. He did it with a handful, I can't remember if it was about 3, but definitely St. Paul Police Department and a couple of others. It's interesting to know that the St. Paul police chief, and he's talked about this, kind of went into it not really bought in, right? But they had somebody looking at all of their data, and what they discovered was that there were huge racial disparities in their stops, but after they implemented this policy, those racial disparities went way down. It did not impact public safety. They found about the same amount of guns. Because if you're an officer and you develop, I don't want to get weedy into legal language, but probable cause, legal justification, you're going to be more successful in finding contraband than if you're just going off a hunch. So their data shows us that just across the river, no impact on public safety, and Chief Axel Henry says that he believes that it created more trust in the community. He can see that. And that is because you are not stopping black and brown drivers for really no reason that turns up anything. And law enforcement really we all need the cooperation of community members, right? When we have unsolved crimes, you need community members to be stepping forward and saying, I have this information. And so that's the piece of it that builds public safety, public trust, by you're not pulling people over that know they're being kind of profiled and they don't find anything. And for that reason, they're more likely to talk to police. That comes from the chief of police in St. Paul. So we see lived experience here. The sky didn't fall in. The data is great. It continues to be great just across the river. And that's consistent with everything across the country as well. And we anticipate it will be the same here in Hennepin County.
Yeah, the data piece is so interesting and tricky for me, because I think, we look at situations like, just for instance, when the National Guard was going to go into DC, and the police department there had some numbers, and then the White House is saying, well, those numbers were not right, they were skewed a little bit. And so I think it's so tricky for people to look at the data points. And it's a weird world that we live in where data becomes, you have a question mark around that. And again, I don't want to do a data dive here, but I think that perception piece is really important, because if you look at, and I'm sure you've seen it, the comments from people, the community, and then we heard from law enforcement on the record that they say this is a critical tool for them to be able to have these pretext stops, so that they can, they can stop sort of public harm, or stop a major crime from happening. So when they say that, I think as a community member, I go, well, we want them to have all the tools that we can. But you're saying that the data shows it's negligible.
So I agree. We all want public safety, right? And so if and there is data, like crime in DC was going down. There's the FBI statistics, data you can actually rely on, crime was going down. In fact, the National Guard came in from some red states that had higher crime rates than DC did. So I think people need to look at what is kind of fabricated and what the actual information is. So for here, yes, people should want law enforcement to have the tools that they need. And like you said, to prevent harm from happening. If they see harm happening, absolutely pull somebody over. This non-public safety traffic stop policy prevents, or it won't prevent, but it limits harm done to community members, which includes, I mean, right here in Minnesota, we had Philando Castile and Dante Wright. That is something that can happen because those are both pretext stops. And Philando Castile was pulled over about 49 times before he was shot and killed. So what I would say to people is, the data's the data, right? You've had Chief O'Hara on. He confirms that the data is accurate about MPD. We have had 2 investigations into MPD that resulted in consent decrees, one in the state and one in federal. They confirm all of that data, which is why one of the things that the city of Minneapolis has entered into is to not do these stops.
It's part of the consent decrees, right?
Yeah.
So they're already, this is something they've already signed off on and are doing in Minneapolis, or will be.
Will be, probably get a report at the end of this month, so we'll be able to see what kind of progress they're making. But that is consistent. So there isn't data over here, data over here. Chief O'Hara agrees with it, both consent decrees did. And so I think people need to ask themselves, why is law enforcement saying, this is going to hinder us? I think people need to ask that. And I think some misrepresentations there are this. You hear about Timothy McVeigh. You probably heard that. Yep. He was actually pulled over because he did not have a rear license plate. Wouldn't have come under this policy. Yeah, absolutely. There was a situation that I recall, it was like a couple of years ago, where one of the suburban police departments pulled over somebody, and they had kind of a unique gun that was matched to a shooting in Minneapolis. That would probably fall under our exception. So we have an exception. So if police pull somebody over on a pretext stop and there is a deceased person in the trunk or something, that comes under the exception.
I was going to ask you, is there a common thread? I mean, if there's a gun in the car, is there something, because you'd said exceptions will be case by case,
yes,
which I think we can all understand that, but
then,
will there be a threshold? Will there be a common thread where you'll go, okay, if there's a gun, we're going to do this, but if not, I mean, is there anything like that?
Well, we have actually had numerous conversations with John Choi about that, because they have an exception too. And so I think, I feel like they've had, I want to get these numbers right, but they have overridden their policy about 5 times. And I think one of them involved guns, one of them involved a large amount of drugs. What County Attorney Choi has told me a number of times is that police are no longer submitting those kinds of cases, and that they are probably focusing on developing an actual case with probable cause, right? So with limited resources, we want law enforcement to be using their time to focus on dangerous driving, or to focus on the people who do have guns that are using them or are part of shootings and stuff like that. We want law enforcement to be able to have trusting relationships with communities, so that community will give them the information they need to investigate and solve some of these crimes.
Okay. Just really quickly here, one thing kind of occurred to me as I was talking to you about this, and we were talking about the spectrum of these pretext stops, and would there be a way, though, if you didn't do it on the back end, meaning you won't prosecute certain certain felonies, is there a way to do it, though, on the front end, where you take a look at an officer who has made an egregious pretext stop? And I believe if you get pulled over and you're asked to hand over your identification, I believe only the driver has to do that and nobody else in the car. So if they get pulled over and that officer walks around and starts maybe smelling marijuana or something and starts asking for everybody's IDs, or that to me feels like a more egregious pretext type stop. Would there be a way to then address that with that officer and have consequences for that officer, as opposed to kind of doing it on the back end? Do you know what I mean?
I think I do. So I think one of the issues is, and I think you could see this in the data that the sheriff put out there after their press conference, I think in something like over 60,000 of those cases that were traffic stops, they had a conversation. We don't get those cases. We only see cases that they submit when they find something. And that's, so what we're seeing is the half of 1%.
I see.
We're not seeing the 99.5% because those people had nothing, and so they're really, it's very difficult. I mean, it's just impossible for us to go through those cases because we never get them.
You mentioned this, and I pulled the quote here, and you brought it up a little bit earlier, but you said a part of this is acknowledging, quote, significant racialized harm that these stops inflict on our Black and brown community members, sometimes to the point of death, end quote. And I just think about the fact that these are generational problems, and you know, you've talked about the fact that you won't be running for re-election, so people might say, well, why now? Why do this now on your kind of way out? And it has shaken things up quite a bit, you know, why?
Well, for me, it's about public safety. I have actually been fairly shocked at the number of dangerous driving cases I have seen where people have been killed. I see dangerous driving when I look around when I'm driving, and so that's an issue. The other thing is that I think about 8 years ago, I met Valerie Castile. And in meeting her and hearing her talk about what happened to her son, and about that time we were looking at a lot of other type of traffic stops that were resulting in people losing their lives, and we had Dante right here as well. Why now? It's like, why not 5 years ago? Why not 10 years ago? We know this data has been this data for quite a while. We know, and certainly my guess is you've been around people who have said to you, Black people, brown people who have said the talk. They've told you about the talk they have to have. And it's hard to hear a parent talking about how they don't know how to keep their child safe anymore if they're in a car and they get pulled over by an officer. And this doesn't mean that the officer has ill intent. I'm not saying that in a majority of lots of these cases. It just, what we've seen is that these cases can escalate in ways nobody would have predicted. And if we just stop that contact from happening, which actually increases public safety, then hopefully we will have fewer people harmed. And so my answer to that is, why not now? We should have probably been doing this. John Choi has been doing it since 2021 with great results. And I think the number of the racial disparities dropped dramatically over there. So they're still getting the same number of guns. The chiefs over there confirm that public safety hasn't been damaged, and that trust by the community has grown. So I can't think of a better policy to implement here.
So do you feel like the criticism, and you alluded to this a little bit earlier, is coming more from a place of, you know, certain decisions that you've made, or people just don't like you, or they don't like working with you, they don't agree with a more, and I don't know if this is a fair characterization, but more of like a social justice, civil rights kind of, you know, layer that you have in your tenure here? Do you think that that is what's going on here?
A couple of things there. I have focused on public safety. And public safety, in my mind, has to be around data and research. I'm interested in doing what works, which is a reflection of this policy, right? Why do we want to do something that doesn't work? Our recidivism rates in Hennepin County and elsewhere too, meaning the percentage of people who come back after they've committed a crime, are really high. So we could look at those and say, you know, we're not doing a great job rehabilitating people coming back. So how can we improve that? And those are the types of things we focus on. We focus on how to prevent young people from being involved in the system, and we've done that a number of ways. We also send people to prison practically every day. You know, we issue press releases. I mean, I look at the press release and I think, you know, the number of people we have sent to prison is a lot. And that is appropriate for some people. They're not safe in the community. So if we're focusing on public safety, we knew the things that work for public safety. Now, in terms of why people react that way, I think the non-public safety traffic stop is perfect. Why is it that John Choi has done it successfully over in Ramsey County since 2021, and people have this reaction when we're implementing it here? What is that about? I think in many ways I've become some kind of lightning rod. Some people will just point at anything we do, even if it's already being done successfully. And I think you saw that perhaps with your interview with Congressman Emmer, right? I did go back and look at that interview, and you were asking him questions about mass shootings and enunciation at the time. Yeah. I suspect you were about to ask him about gun violence, right? And he knew that. And he also knows that most people in the United States do not believe that community members need to have access to assault rifles. But instead of allowing you to ask that question and respond in a civilized way, because he was interrupting you and kind of shouting at you, it was rude to you. But rather than letting you ask that, he knew where you were going, and then suddenly, pivoted to hurling insults at me that had absolutely nothing to do with what you were talking about. And I think that's what happens when people know their actual positions aren't supported by data, or that people want something different. They just pivot and they attack a person and yell about that and make up a bunch of things. And I think that that's particularly dangerous in this time. Of course, we've seen a lot of political violence, and I think it's irresponsible to engage in that kind of hurling insults and kind of reckless behavior when we have people being shot and killed. I think Republicans everybody's starting to talk about being more civil, right? And so rather than hurling insults at me when you were not asking him anything to do about me, because he didn't want to answer that question. Like, how come you in Congress, you aren't doing anything about guns when we keep seeing children being shot and we know guns are part of the problem? And he did not want to answer that question, and so he just started hurling insults at me.
I think you bringing up the Trooper Londrigan case, I think, is probably at the heart of this and I don't want to assume, but for some law enforcement and politicians, perhaps on the right, that is really when you talk about a lightning rod situation. Do you see kind of where they're coming from, where if that's their foundation and saying, well, boy, she just really, screwed that up, or, the things that they're saying. Do you acknowledge that? Do you see that? Do you kind of take that in, or do you just say, I can't even kind of deal with that because there's so many different layers to this?
Well, I understand that has become a talking point for them. What I will say about it is we did exactly the right thing at all steps of the way, which meant actually dismissing the case when we didn't feel that we should go forward. And that is something new for prosecutors, and it's something that we have instilled in our office too. Sometimes there can be this, I charged it, I have to go through with it, right? But if it's not the right thing to do, you shouldn't be doing it, and that's something we talk to our people about. You are always gathering new information, wherever that comes from. And if there reaches a point where you should not ethically be going forward with the prosecution, you have to let it go. So we did that. It's also important to know that we do work with law enforcement a lot. There were law enforcement people who told me that Londrigan should have been charged. So, people are entitled to have different opinions. Absolutely. There are some people who felt he should be charged, some people who didn't, some people who thought it shouldn't have happened, but he shouldn't have been charged. That's legitimate. People should be able to talk about that. But we should also be able to work together, which we do. I mean, we worked with all of law enforcement on ERPOs, Extreme Risk Protection Orders. I hired Raina Alexander to be a coordinator of that. She's done a lot of training and coordination with law enforcement throughout Hennepin County. We worked with, and this was a policy we developed with Hennepin County law enforcement, our youth auto theft initiative, and they refer young people to us. But if you ask them to talk about it publicly, they won't. Because it's become some kind of, if you stand up next to me, even if you're telling your community that you're doing great things, which some of these police departments are, they just refuse to do it because it means standing up next to me. And I think that's a problem, because I think we all we are working together, actually, and I do think the community should know that and understand that we do work together, and we are going to disagree sometimes.
We have about a minute left. I just want to ask the last question here is just, you know, after you leave, someone else could come in. Could they just reverse everything that you just did here? Do you anticipate that?
Well, many of the things that we've done are things that won't be changed. For instance, we have a conviction integrity unit, right? And we just had an exoneration of a man who had been in prison for 27 years for something he didn't do. And that was created when I came into the office. So my expectation is that the public, the community, people will say, hey, that's been doing good work, and I think that that's true of a lot of the things that we have done. When I'm out in community, I talk to people about what we're doing. They say, oh, that's great. How come we never hear about that? And so when they really hear about the public safety aspects that we're doing, they are generally on board. But it is almost always portrayed as me doing something, and because I'm doing it, it must be controversial.
Okay. We really appreciate you making the time to come in here. These conversations, I think, hopefully are helpful to people who see headlines here and there and different accounts, and to be able to hear, just like we did with Congressman Emmer yesterday, just like with you, and then they can make up kind of their own mind. So thanks for taking the time to come in.
I appreciate you inviting me in here to talk about these. I'm always willing to talk about what we're doing. I believe in transparency and believe in helping people understand what's actually happening. So thank you.